good morning. Welcome. I guess you did not expect me here, you expected Johannes, but Johannes could not make it here, but he will join us remotely and I will help him to guide the questions, but he will introduce the session. So if you can bring up Johannes onto the screen. No, that's Sarita. Yeah, that looks good. So Johannes, I guess we can see your shared screen, or well, the
yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, more than enough.
Oh. Okay. I am not able to turn on my video, so I will just leave it like this. It says that the host has disabled this function, so I'll leave it like this for now. I guess it's better with the video on, if possible. Perfect. Now let's see. Okay. Excellent. So, hi. Now I see the room and I see myself. Thank you very much. Yes. So I'm Johannes Svensson. I'll just start by introducing myself quickly. I'm Johannes Svensson. I work at IDRI, which is a Paris-based think tank on sustainable development and international relations, and there I work specifically in the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Initiative. As a researcher on climate change and land use policy. So unfortunately, I'm not able to participate in person, which is of course a great shame. It would be much better to be there in person. But thank you very much to the organizers to finding some last-minute solutions, and thanks also to those helping out in the room. To introduce the session, basically this session we made it, or we sort of construed the description as with a focus on discussing country-driven national deep decarbonization scenarios that are consistent with global carbon neutrality between 2050 and 2070, in line with the IPCC estimates of required emission reductions for achieving the Paris Agreement global mitigation target. And the objective is, of course, to focus on the pathways themselves, but more so to focus on the policy lessons that can be derived for national decision-making regarding synergies, trade-offs, and risks with other country non-climate objectives, and on sort of short-term policies and actions that come out as necessary from these pathways. And in a way, this session, I hope at least, will be an opportunity to reflect on the methodological challenges faced when developing national scenarios, capturing a broad set of key national circumstances with the primary objectives to inform both national and international stakeholder consultation. So, I mean, here, and I want to emphasize that, of course, the objective here is to discuss how we can use pathways to engage with stakeholders and to work vis-a-vis policy, and both on a national and international level. And in terms of the session here, then we just saw Amit Garg and Sarita Vishwanathan from the India Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. We also have a presentation on Germany from Gunnar Luderer at the peak. A presentation on the US from Haywon McGeon at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and the University of Maryland. And then, so that's in terms of national sort of presentations on national decarbonization pathways. Then we also have a presentation on the ambition gap as sort of one approach of bridging national and international analytical scales by Matthias Weitzel from the Joint Research Center. And lastly, a deep dive into the role of solar by Femke Nischse at the University of Exeter. I effectively disappeared, so I don't know if the best option is for me to jump on and pursue with my own presentation.
I think we should. I think we should go ahead with that option. So
yeah,
I don't know if you can share your slides if you're allowed to do that. So if Zoom lets you do that, then please go ahead.
Perfect. I will do that. Hang on. Just a couple of seconds, actually. Are you now seeing my slide? Just to double check. It seems so.
Yes.
Perfect. Excellent. Okay. Well, then, basically, my presentation here is titled National Pathways and Global Narratives, Insights from the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Initiative. And as I explained before, my name is Johannes Svensson. I'm a researcher on land use and climate change policy at IDRI. Let's see if I can. Yes. So my presentation actually has two parts. It was originally intended as two separate presentations. The first one is on sort of methodological insights from the bottom-up national decarbonization analysis that we've been doing in the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Initiative over the last 8 years, basically, since 2014. And the second second part is on a new methodological development within the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Initiative, aiming to sort of identify global enablers of national transformations in these national pathways that we are working with, and put these forward, put these global enablers forward to global climate dialogues, basically. And I mean, that will become clearer in the second part of the presentation. But the second part is called Global Narratives, Drawing Insights for Global Cooperation from National Decarbonization Pathways. The first part, I mean, I'm not gonna take more time on introducing this, but basically in terms of introducing a quick introduction of the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Initiative. Basically what we are doing is to develop scientifically robust analysis of pathways towards carbon neutrality, and including other socioeconomic and environmental objectives into the sort of the targets of these pathways. The objective is then to use these analyses to structure conversations with decision makers and stakeholders in terms of the options and risks for transforming societies to meet defined objectives. And going to get back a bit to how this objective has shaped the methodology that we're working with, but it's also really in a sense the approach and more so than the approach, even in a sense what we are, the DDP. It's very much a country-driven work. We work with country teams in a multitude of countries, including with the IIMA, Professor Garg and Sarita that presented before me in India, and the pathways that they then build are defined in a very bottom-up manner, like it's country-driven, country-led, and country-owned, as I've put it here. But of course, we derive, I mean, there's a strength coming from being a community of practice, and I just wanted to show, I mean, that we work with a lot of countries all over the world, with sometimes with active collaborations in ongoing projects, sometimes with non-active, but still where we have a country partner, and other times where we have a more lighter touch collaboration. The method that we has developed over time is very much, I mean, sort of, the work is country owned, so each country defines their pathways in their own way. But we have a shared method that we are all that all these analysis, all these country pathways depart from. Some of the core principles in this method is to backcast from long-term climate and socioeconomic goals, and thereby derive the short-term transformations that are necessary to achieve these goals. It's to develop both quantitative pathways and detailed narratives. So and with detailed, it's I mean, really developing a storyline of what's going on on a multitude of variables in the pathways, and especially exploring the drivers behind the transformations, and these detailed narratives are particularly useful for engaging with non-experts. I mean, if it's regarding a sectoral deep dive, it's useful for engaging with non-sectoral experts, and I mean, in general, for engaging with non-experts on the topics. We develop comparable cross-country comparable results, with an emphasis on making the assumptions and the results transparent, and also providing a high granularity of detail on the physical transformation in key sectors. So using sectoral deep dives to really explore this in detail, and this granularity has proven quite useful also for engaging with policymakers in terms of being able to actually describe what's, I mean, if you want to roll out renewable energy, what are the demands on infrastructure, what are the investment I mean, yeah, to have a high granularity of detail on the very physical transformation. And here I've just put a graph describing the method in a quick way, but I will skip this in the interest of time. And here, just to say that the method is common across the the teams that we're working with, but there are different models at use. So in that sense here, the method is a bit distinct from the quantitative models. And I guess the first observation is that there is no one-size-fits-all model. Here's a table just from one of our collaborators, a paper written in 2016 outlining different types of models and where their strengths and respective weaknesses lie. Just to say that, of course, models are defined to respond to specific questions, which they often respond to very well. But the questions that each country will ask themselves, the questions that are a priority in each team, vary, and therefore the needs from modeling might vary as well. So importantly, each country team will consider the national circumstances and policy priorities when choosing a model or a modeling structure, and this means that in the end, the results, the modeling tools used vary across teams. That's a bit of an introduction or of a presentation of the sort of the way we work. I think in terms of the most recent example of our work is a project that's just about being concluded, called the BIX project, where we also work with colleagues from the IIMA, but also with other colleagues from Brazil, Indonesia, and South Africa. There we've really worked on producing economy-wide trajectories for greenhouse gas emissions, population, GDP, etc. I've projected some two graphs, one on the carbon intensity of the GDP, shrinking diminishing in all countries and reaching negatives in Brazil, and also on the overarching CO2 emissions. There's no graphs here, but we have also explored in detail sectoral breakdowns for electricity, passenger transport and freight transport and FOW. I'll upload these slides later on because there's some references to some more information for those interested. However, what I feel is more interesting here, let me again find the swap here, perfect, is to draw some overarching policy insights from this project. And basically there we have, what we can see is that carbon neutrality by 2050, 2070 is feasible in all the country contexts. It's possible to achieve carbon neutrality and key socioeconomic goals as defined by each country. I mean, we can construe pathways that achieve these goals in tandem, if the goals are taken into account sufficiently early on. Delaying action is, we can clearly see that this is a dead end. Without, going in detail, it means that even the magnitude of the actions required at a later point grow. And this is also proven elsewhere in a lot of research. So it's not rocket science, but it's also shown it also arises as a conclusion from this project. And also ensuring that the necessary transformations take place requires both a coordinated action among different types of actors and comprehensive policy packages, meaning that there is no silver bullet policy instrument. And furthermore, international cooperation is a critical enabler of national transitions. And this is sort of the focus of the second part, which I will go through a little bit quicker because I see that I'm using a bit of time here. But basically focusing on global narratives, so focusing on these international conditions, drawing insights from global cooperation for global cooperation from national decarbonization pathways. And here, the reason why we feel that this sort of methodological development is necessary is that there is the global stocktake is in a way is coming up in 2023. It's a key moment for the international community to one, take stock of progress so far, but also to make sure it's also a moment for ratcheting up national climate ambition and global climate ambition, and it's important to make sure that the global stocktake, but also climate negotiations and dialogues more broadly can serve this purpose. We see that information on national decarbonization and global decarbonization is there, and there are attempts to analytically bridge these two the two scales, but not with the explicit objective of informing international climate dialogues. And therefore, so here I will try to explore quickly what a method looks like that draws insights regarding global conditions for the enhanced national climate actions, and sort of how what are the necessary elements of this method to ensure that the insights are truly useful for driving up national ambition. So the objective is to facilitate constructive dialogues between national and global stakeholders around key global enablers of increased national climate ambition. This method that I'm presenting, the global narratives, we hope that it can feed this objective by providing the substance for constructive dialogues, by identifying and proposing global enablers of increased national climate action and ambition to global climate negotiations. And I mean, so of course, originally the order was intended to be the inverse, but Professor Garg was able to touch upon some of these. I mean, to propose some of these global enablers for India, for the Indian pathway. So I guess that becomes an illustration of the potential use of this. In terms of definition, a global narrative is a global narrative quantitatively and qualitatively characterizes a broad set of global conditions that enable national transformations emerging from specific country perspectives, and merges this into a coherent narrative at the international level. And some points to explain, to give some more flesh to this. Basically, it's important to point to that the starting point for this work is always national pathways. So it's, in a way, as opposed to a top-down approach, national pathways, and then it becomes the task is to identify what are the assumptions regarding global enablers that are embedded in these national transformations. Um, Furthermore, that's an important point. So, in order to make sure that these global enablers are pertinent for the national scale and that they are sort of policy relevant and actionable, it's important that the national pathways that we use in the building global narratives are defined in a bottom-up way and that they provide granular detail of the physical transformation. I will skip a bit quickly here because I see that I'm taking more time than I planned, but there's a building block for this method is the gene is a global enabler narrative element, describing a global enabler of national transformation, but also developing a narrative around the enabler, notably by identifying actors necessary to develop a solution, and also venturing a bit into the action space. So what are the actions that must be taken? And I'll come to an example in a second here. The value of aggregating this into a global narrative is to check the coherency and make sure that the genes that we identify, the global enabler narrative elements, do not point to contradicting implications for the same or similar actors. So for instance, the example given here was that a reduced cost of capital for the rollout of renewable energy infrastructure has implications for a range of actors. It's important to make sure that when we sort of compile a global narrative based on this, that the actions falling on each set of actors is not contradictory. A second point is to provide a transformative vision of systemic change. Basically, are there some overarching global conditions that are not linked to specific national transformations, but more to more systemic change? And that's also, I mean, identifying these overarching global conditions is another value of moving from working with these genes to the global narrative. We'll actually jump directly to an example because I think that's illustrative at this point to just quickly say what we're talking about, because otherwise it risks being very abstract. So in the work, in the BICS project, one gene, so one global enabler narrative element that's clearly come out is the availability and cost of capital available to emerging economies, here looking at Brazil, India, Indonesia, and South Africa, to finance the rollout of renewable energy infrastructure. Not only renewable energy infrastructure, but also electric vehicles, sustainable agriculture, and some others. And to move into the action space of this global enabler, what we have to start looking at, and what we are looking at as we speak in a way, is what are the potential sources of this capital? Where can it come from? Is it private? Is it public? Is it mixed? I mean, there's a range of financial solutions, but those are key questions. What are the strategies to ensure that global agents commit to ensure that financial flows are in line with the 1.5 degree Paris target? So in terms of strategies, this could be de-risking financial transfers, it could be co-financing arrangements, etc. And lastly, of course, we must expect that the countries themselves, in order to benefit from support from international actors, put in place institutional arrangements that that corresponds with what the financiers request, and therefore identifying these institutional arrangements is another important point. Just because it's here, I thought this could be an interesting slide to delve to discuss briefly, because I think basically the way I see it, this method on global narratives is complementary to work on the SSPs and the overarching scenario framework. In the sense that the SSPs, they produce, this is a way of building global scenarios. These global scenarios, they produce global benchmarks, that are then used for national scenarios, to inform national scenarios together with national assumptions, or assumptions coming from the national scale. So global scenarios that feed into national scenarios, and then where this global narrative, the global narratives come in, is that we then extract the global enablers and the actors that are necessary to bring about the national transformations, and use these to inform global climate dialogues. So in that sense, it's in that sense, I see this work as quite complementary to work on the SSPs. I've taken a lot of time, indeed, and of course, this was, apologize for that. This was 2 presentations merged into one, so I had planned to take a little bit more time, but I ended up taking more time than planned. So sorry for that. Matthias, I see that you're prepared to take over. So I guess that we can. The plan. My plan was to do 3 presentations in this first session. So then handing it over to I can take some questions on this and then hand it over to Gunnar Luderer. And then, but as this is a double session, we have 3 presentations also planned for the second part, the second session. And after the second session, or sort of at the end of the second session, my idea would be to take a bit of a general discussion on how national pathways feed into, how to use national pathways to engage with stakeholders and to work with towards policymaking.
Thanks, Johannes. I think that's basically the way going forward. So are there any quick questions? I think we may have time for a question or 2 if they're more specific, and then go with an in-depth discussion towards the end. Seeing none for the moment, I guess then I would invite Gunnar Luderer to come up to present his work on German pathways and how Germany can come to climate neutrality.
Thanks a lot, Matthias. I hope my slides will come in a minute. Are they going to be here as well? Oh, I have to put them up myself. Perfect, thanks a lot. So my talk is about the German climate neutrality target by 2045, which turns out to be quite demanding, and that's why I also put up this overall title about when net zero means zero fossil. So that shows. We will see in a minute why this is an important aspect. So let me start with a few quick facts. So we in Germany still are a bit below 10 tons of CO2 equivalents per capita emissions, which is roughly double the global average. At the same time, this is down 40% from 1990 levels, largely due to economic restructuring of Eastern Germany after 1990. We just barely reached the nominal target of 40% reduction relative to 1990 in 2020 with a little help from the COVID crisis. So that's that's where we stand currently. And the German government has put up the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions to zero by 2045. At the same time, we also have still substantial reliance on coal, mostly for power supply, around 30%, which adds also to the current emission situations and the challenge. So if we look at the trends of the past decades, it gets very clear that there's also a sectoral story. So on the energy supply side, this is actually where most of the reductions were achieved, and also like a bit on other non-CO2 emissions. But then if you look into the demand sectors, there's a bit of reduction again in buildings, very slight reductions in industry, but for transport, for example, it's really very, very stable, those emissions. And these are, of course, the sectors where we need to radically ramp up the pace of emission reductions to move towards that 2045 target. So roughly what you can say is the pace of reduction that we saw over the decade before the COVID crisis needs to be trebled to pave the way for the 2045 target. So Germany is not only interesting because, like, from a German national perspective, I would argue it's also quite relevant for like a broader international climate policy perspective. It is, to my knowledge, the biggest economy yet to pursue a climate neutrality target already before 2050. German climate policy is strongly intertwined with EU climate policy, so the EU climate policy, of course, matters for the German context, and at the same time Germany matters for EU because it's the biggest single economy within the EU. And what's also interesting is we have a concurrent phase-out policy for nuclear power. Actually, from next year on, that's still the plan. We would stop the last nuclear power plant, and we have very low acceptance for CCS. What that all means can be illustrated if we look at climate neutrality pathways broken down with these emissions by different sectors. So in the what we have here is a certain degree of non-CO2 emissions. It's not so much for Germany, but it's still significant. And then secondly, the big question is how much negative emissions, how much carbon sinks can we afford? And if you conservatively account for the natural land sinks, it turns out that there's pretty limited scope for negative emissions, around 50 megatons of CO2, and that's pretty much enough to balance our non-CO2 emissions, but that then also means that on the fossil residual CO2 emission side, there's nothing left. And that then, of course, means that climate neutrality by 2024, like broadly means an almost complete phase out of fossils to the extent that we have also limited CCS potential and acceptance. So to shed further light on that situation, we have a very large-scale project in Germany with many leading German institutes with whom we did a sector-integrated model comparison for Germany. How does it look like? We looked into different scenarios with a focus actually on the dimension on where to get this renewable energy from. On the one hand side, some scenarios that prioritized direct electrification, either with high imports or like a stronger emphasis on domestic production, then scenarios emphasizing a rollout out of hydrogen, and then thirdly, scenarios prioritizing synthetic renewable fuels that then also would be largely imported. So we have multiple models. So the rough idea is we have three full system models here in the purple shading, and then we have additional sector detailed models for industry and transport and also buildings. And then also some, there's a bit of, it goes by itself. And then also some models that help us look into implications for environment or distributional impacts. And the idea is then that we want, on the one hand, to improve our models, like use the sectoral models to better understand what's going on in the global models and also in the full systems model, and also use the full systems models to better describe the energy economic environment in which these sectoral transformations happen. And that will then hopefully help us to identify robust insights and also key uncertainties of that transformation pathway. So in a nutshell, what that means is we have to go from a roughly 80% fossil system right now in terms of final energy, and that's depicted here in the dark shades, the fossil part, and then in the red stuff is electricity, which only accounts for 20% of current final energy demands, and then we still have also 80% non-electric energy demands. And basically, the strategy that's very robust across different scenarios is that, of course, you need energy efficiency improvements, but then no matter what you do, you need to achieve an almost full-scale decarbonization of electricity by 2030. And then the task for the remaining 15 years is to increase electrification basically as far as you can, and then also take care of the remaining blue stuff, which is the non-electric, still largely fossil energy supply that then needs to be decarbonized either by bioenergy, but since that's limited, we need to talk about hydrogen and synfuels. And that's really this strengthening of the targets really has brought us into the synfuel and hydrogen debate, which becomes very important. And that's if we then look at across different scenarios and also different models that's given here, and all the sectoral details, it's a very small print, so I will just focus on the key aspects that characterize these target systems in 2045. What we have that across all scenarios, the share of fossil fuels in final energy falls below 3%, and that's really significant. Within only 23 years to go from 80% to 3% fossils in the system. Final energy demand reduces by roughly 50%, but with a substantial uncertainty. We have between 40 and 70% energy share in final energy. And then the big difference across scenarios is the extent to which you use hydrogen and hydrogen-based e-fuels to cover your remaining non-electric energy demands. So kind of walking through those different scenarios. So we have this electricity focus, hydrogen focus, e-fuel focus. It's kind of interesting to see the differentials in terms of where that hydrogen and synthetic fuels are used. What we see is that even in the most electrification cases, we still need more than 10% of current fossil use in terms of hydrogen and e-fuels by 2045. Some of that like backup electricity, but then also mostly for the demand sectors. And then if you have more hydrogen, you mostly use it for additional, for the industry sector. And then if you have more synfuels, that really helps you on the transport side in the sense of taking it more easy in the electrification of especially freight transportation. So that's really kind of the different worlds that we see, and the degrees of freedom that there still remains within this quite tight emissions structure. So that what then also was very important for us is to spell out for policymakers what the target 2045 means in terms of key transformation milestones that need to be achieved by 2030. Just like a selection, we had a big number of such milestones that we looked into. Just for illustration, coal power. So what I always show is the corridor of results from the scenarios, and then the previous government target that we had. So the previous government policy was coal phase out until 2038, which meant roughly halving only of coal power by 2030. But that is not enough because we need that clean power for the electrification. So we really very robustly see that you basically phase out coal by 2030 already. Secondly, renewable energy share and power. There also the old target was 65%, and we saw in the scenarios rather like 75 to 85%. And then lastly, battery electric vehicles, Old government planning was around 7 million vehicles on the road by 2030, battery electric vehicles. And we had quite substantial uncertainty across the scenarios, but going up between this old target of 7 up to 25 million electric cars. And interestingly, like we published this report right after the German federal election, and then the new coalition formed and they came to a coalition agreement. And was very interesting for us to see that the specific policy targets formulated in the coalition agreement are very much in line with what we see from our scenarios on these specific aspects. So that's encouraging, but still needs to be achieved. It's not enough to just write it into your coalition agreement. Last slide, the kind of how demanding these scenarios are can be gauged by looking at marginal abatement costs implied by those targets. Just a snapshot for 2030, what we see is that marginal abatement costs for this 2030 targets, we have substantial uncertainty across the models, but we're talking about something between 150 and 400 euros per ton CO2. That's much higher than what we see, for example, in the EU impact assessments in terms of carbon prices, which means you either need a lot of additional policies to kind of take away the pressure from the carbon market, or you have to like strengthen the overall framework on carbon pricing. So policies really matter. We have these very high abatement costs in the scenarios, but we also, of course, see we need complementary policies anyway because the transformation goes so fast, it's so coordination intensive. So we need policies for market introduction of new technologies. Infrastructure really matters. So like rolling out that amount of hydrogen really, we need to start now to get that hydrogen for the phase after 2035. And that requires infrastructure, all those planning things. Electric vehicle charging heavily depends on success of infrastructure rollout, especially on the freight side as well. Then also things like heat grids, which are also very, very helpful, also require long-term planning. And then something that also the German government puts a lot of emphasis on is structured planning, zoning, etc. for wind and solar power ramp up. So let me conclude. We see very, very large challenges, but at the same time we see that from the scenario modeling that the feasibility, that this transition is possible to transition to climate neutrality by 2045, basically on the backs of renewables, but it requires a very rapid transformation. Because we have these limited CDR potentials, climate neutrality requires an almost complete phase out of fossil fuels by 2045. But that's only possible if then on the other hand we have hydrogen and hydrogen-based e-fuels as a replacement for those sectors where we have difficulties to do away with carbon-based fuels. And then we also see that actually maybe more difficult than reaching the 2045 point is getting those milestones in place by 2030 to enable those deeper transformations for the time between 2030 and 2045. I'm looking forward to the questions and discussions.
Thank you, Gunnar. Well, we can stay here, I guess, to answer. I see a first question, 2 questions, 3 questions. Very good. So I guess we'll start there and then we move over.
Lara Welder from Climate Analytics. So we have been working with Remind scenarios in the past, and we noticed that in the transport sector, there was still like a notable share of biofuels in the scenario. And I was wondering, on the one hand, like in comparison to the scenario we see now, how did the shares like transitions, like did they become smaller? And then you mentioned that biomass is a limited resource, so I was wondering like what the modeling preference of the German model are with respect to, like biofuels versus hydrogen. So yeah, these were my 2 questions.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask exact opposite of that question. So you're looking at $300 or 300 euros per ton at carbon price, and you're showing e-fuels being, very strongly being used in the transport sector. I would have thought at $300, either biofuel with CCS or direct air capture would be just as competitive. So under what conditions, why do e-fuels outcompete the other options?
Yeah, great questions. So Remind scenarios are not created equal, so we have a variety. So that's why I cannot answer this generically. But indeed, like this entire biofuel, CCS dynamics, it's basically a question of how big the potentials are. And like if you look at Germany as opposed to US, I would guess we just have very limited sustainable bioenergy potentials. And also you have to keep in mind for bioenergy, you just need 10 times as much land per unit of energy compared to wind and solar. So that's why under the assumption that we have, that we restrict bioenergy use, and under the assumption also that we don't have large-scale imports of bioenergy, because that also tends to be problematic from a sustainability perspective, then you're just stuck with this e-fuel and hydrogen kind of strategy. And the big question is, to what extent do you need it? It will depend a lot on your demand-side transformations. And actually in transport, only in the synfuel scenarios, we use a lot of synfuels. Otherwise, you electrify that. And actually, that's a cheaper strategy, that's a better one, but it really requires scaling up technologies, getting infrastructures in place, and you have to start now. So that's really what happens. But of course, if we allowed for imports, if we allowed for large-scale, let's say, shipping of our CO2 to offshore Dutch carbon sinks, that would change the picture and loosen also some of the other constraints.
Yeah, thank you. The German climate law also includes a net negative target for 2050. And I was just wondering, like, how would your numbers change if you project them into net negative in 2050? Can you say anything on that? Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I should know that, but is there a concrete number on the net negative for 2050?
Not a concrete number, but saying that they will need to achieve net negative, as in the EU climate law as well. So they just set it also as a target.
So what we do is we just we run the model for until 2100, and keeping the carbon price constant after 2045, you immediately go in the net negative regime, just because the path dependencies kind of slowly fade out, and you start to have your hydrogen and everything, so that then, like in our scenarios, we tend to have, I think, around 50, no, maybe, yeah, between 30 and 50 megatons negative in 2050, and then in principle there's potential to kind of grow that a bit further.
Hi, I'm Anna Krokrekora from Luleå, Sweden, looking at the Swedish energy transition. And I wonder a bit how you look on their trade with other countries. I will provide an example, because Sweden now we are exporting a lot of iron pellets. And what we are doing now is instead using the hydrogen, and we are going to export something called iron sponge. And that will actually replace the blast furnace in other countries. Are you considering this, or are you considering that you are replacing everything like blast furnace with your in-house things? Yeah,
that's a great question, and that's actually really something of our research priorities. It's like in these scenarios, we are pretty conservative regarding relocation of kind of the early stages of material production. But I think that's problematic, and actually the stakeholders want us to do it. And actually the government, like throughout the political spectrum, the default assumption is that Germany will remain like every part of its industry as it is right now. And I think that's a very faulty assumption, given that we are so disadvantaged with our renewable potentials compared to other places. So we are currently working on scenarios that would exactly push some of those very energy-intensive first stages of the value chains offshore, like ammonia production, like some basic chemicals, like steel. And it would make a lot of sense, but the German industry doesn't like it, the government doesn't like it, no one likes it besides energy wonders. So.
Yeah, okay, so thanks a lot, Gunnar, for the very interesting and important presentation. I think, well, it looks all good, like you have the trajectory, how to get there, the government and everybody is at least with the targets on there. But at the same time, like now, for example, with the reality of the prices of the energies and their cascading through the different sectors of the economy, and it started already way before the Ukrainian crisis, right? So how really much consideration you put into the economic and socio-economic or whatever implications of these scenarios?
Yeah, we're working now on a scenario update or scenario variants to take into account the energy crisis, and I think it's a very interesting aspect. So, like, basically to understand the interaction between climate policy and kind of energy security or policies. And what we see is it's not so bad. So, like, of course, it helps to have high fossil prices overall because you start thinking harder about accelerating your building sector refurbishment. That's one of the very critical bottlenecks, the pace at which we can refurbish our houses and install heat pumps. And that has gotten like a big acceleration. Then this entire value chain thing that was just mentioned, it is pushed on the table because of that. So that also helps us to get into these debates. And then, of course, you have trade-offs because there is a tendency to replace gas with coal also. But I think that's a relatively limited and short-term effect to the extent you just use existing plans. What's the greater risk is that climate policy overall gets under fire. And that's more like an EU-level issue. Like, to what extent are we able to stick to the Fit for 55 program, given that everyone is concerned about energy prices. So, and of course, what our modeling also shows is that if you loosen your climate targets, you also lose a lot on the energy security side, because the difference between a 55% reduction and going back to like 40 or 45% reduction is the amount of action that you do in the building sector, for example, buildings and transport sector. So taking it easy on those sectors will really hurt us in the medium term regarding our energy security situation.
Thank you. Are there any more questions for Gunnar? Not from the audience. Then I may misuse the position of having been upgraded to chair and ask my question myself. So you had already mentioned that there is kind of two stages. Like, first you'll decarbonize electricity until 2030, and then the second stage is, well, basically electrifying everything. How much of that second stage will already need to be considered already in the coming decade? Because I guess there is more upfront investment in terms of more like R&D also. Maybe you can elaborate a bit more, and then I invite you already in the audience while Gunnar is answering to also maybe think a bit broader, since we have about 10 minutes left, whether you have any questions still to Sarita or Johannes, or maybe you have already a more overarching questions on the use of scenarios, but we can also tackle that in the second part of this session.
Yeah, great question, and I realize I need to be very careful in communicating that. Actually, what I should say is that after 2030, like, the efforts in these sectors come to bear in terms of delivering emission reductions. But of course, you have to start earlier. So Adrian presented very nicely yesterday about the hydrogen pipeline. It will take us our 10 or 15 years until we get that hydrogen chain in, like, scale it up to a level where we actually see it on a graph. So really, and we have to start now on those areas, even though they won't help us much for the 2030 reduction targets. So, like, actually all hands on board, all sectors, all actions need to start now, and some will help in the short term and others will rather help in the longer term.
Thanks. Are there any points, remarks, Lara? Where's the microphone? Oh, thanks. Well, we can do it the other way around, so since you already spoke.
Yeah, Jessica Jewell-Chalmers University. I actually had a question for Johannes. I think he's still online. When you say country-owned, what do you mean? And how do these compare to any national plans or targets? Yeah, and then for Gunnar, you talk about kind of the delay of hydrogen, which is totally plausible. Have you looked at all about the speed limit of renewables? Yeah, because, yeah, you know my question.
Johannes?
Yeah, of course. No, thank you. And I'll respond briefly. I think what I mean is that it's when we say basically the way we work is that we have a lot of we work together with analytical teams in a lot of teams, such as Sarita and Professor Garg in India, and then it's probably Sarita is actually better placed to answer your question. I think it would be interesting to have the perspective of the Indian case in terms of how this has been done in India, but I know that, I mean, in India, and it's been a long dialogue with also us at IDRI on how to integrate national plans into the scenarios that they are building. I know that in other partnering countries, Indonesia, for instance, there the analytical team that we're working with played a very big role in defining the national the LTS that they came up with last year, I think. So I mean, of course, this varies on a country-to-country basis, but perhaps I'd ask if Sarita could step in and explain how this has been the case in India.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Okay, great. So the difference over here is basically because I have participated in CD Links and Engage. There we were given like a carbon budget, so it was more a top-down when it comes to. So we were given a specific carbon budget, allocated a carbon budget, and then there were questions that were asked that are we able to reduce? And it's like initially it was how was it early action, late action, and then in the past couple of years about net zero and peaking and net zero. Here in DDP PICS, what we were asked is what does the country wants? And will the country, so when we are talking about the feasible, the plausible, and the implementation actions perspective, it is from a bottom-up question like how would the country wants to transform itself? So that is how we approached the whole exercise when it came in this project. And then how can a country inform at a global level, the global stakeholders, the international stakeholders, when we are talking about global governance? Yesterday, like in a plenary session, they said that it is kind of difficult. So for me, the question is, how can we inform from our perspective what the nations need and how we are it's kind of both ways. So I'll give you two examples. So one example we kind of showed was hydrogen, where we are actually completely dependent on how the hydrogen prices will decrease, and that would also impact the technology deployment in our country. But at the same time, 10 years ago, India had a solar manufacturing policy when we had the National Solar Mission. However, it completely failed in India because the Chinese manufacturing took over and it decreased prices at a very drastic rate. So as a developing country, even if we have policies which are thinking ahead, there are failures in these policies to be self-sufficient. So this time around, we are also taking the approach in informing that we require these things to be able to transform, in fact, going towards net zero. So that is making whatever our targets are, which are ambitious enough to be more ambitious. So that is, one is like a top-down approach where we are given this is the allocation and what will the country do. And here we are given the space to say, oh, I mean, I don't think this is possible. And if you want this at an international level, what we require as a country. So I hope I'm able to answer. I mean, was it? Yeah.
Thanks. Do you want to answer the question?
Yeah, I can take the last question, obviously. So yeah, where we look both into hydrogen scaling, actually I referenced Adrian's work and also, of course, renewable scaling. The difference being that hydrogen is at the very beginning, so we like think about an exponential growth, and there we see like to get anywhere close to what we need at EU level, but also in Germany by mid to end 2030, you really have to exceed what we've seen in terms of early development growth rates in wind and solar. And that it requires government action, but there's also quite a lot of money and action behind it. Then for wind and solar, we are in this different phase, and you like know it much better than I, which is basically about mature technologies ramping up to kind of dominance in the respective sector. And you can make a very simple arithmetic. So we are currently at 40%, and we need to be at 80% in 2030. And it's actually even more difficult because there's inertia in the pipeline. So all the reforms that we now have in kind of reducing the red tape for wind permitting, etc., will only materialize in 3, 4, 5 years' time. But at the same time, I think it's a natural experiment for your hypothesis on the speed limit, on how fast you can roll out your renewables, because it's a case of a reasonably rich country, which puts a lot of political capital in the success of those goals. And if under such circumstances, it's possible to kind of get into the range of 10, 15, 20, actually, like on the solar side, it will be 20 percentage points market share in a decade, and then similarly on wind and offshore wind, what we need to get to our 80%.
Following up on the discussion of how fast we can roll out hydrogen infrastructure, so I was wondering to what level of detail hydrogen infrastructure was modeled in the scenarios. So like, was it like modeled on a transport storage level, different like transport storage option considered, which might be rolled out faster?
That's the benefit that we have is that we have multiple models. Like in Remind, we are not able to represent infrastructure, but it's always good to talk to infrastructure modelers, and we have them. And they say, like from Fraunhofer Easy or IEE, and they say, well, it's a chicken egg problem. You need your backbone. You then need to get the stuff distributed. And what certainly is the case is that there will be a very heterogeneous availability of hydrogen in the beginning. So it will be easier in the northwest of Germany, where stuff might be shipped in via Rotterdam or our other seaports, and also where our domestic wind production sits. And it will put our industrial centers in the south in a kind of disadvantage because it will take longer until that hydrogen comes there. Another very useful insight in my view is that for the building sector, where we not only need the transmission grid of hydrogen, but also the distribution grid, it's very, very far-fetched to have that switched to hydrogen just because it's super expensive, it's super coordination intensive. You cannot, it's actually inconceivable to have like a second grid next to the natural gas grid. In hydrogen, it's just like way too expensive, way too complex. At the same time, it's very difficult to switch a gas grid to hydrogen just over the summer. Because you would have to replace all the burners and everything. So that really restricts you a lot more to these big hydrogen demand centers for power and big industrial manufacturers.
Matthias, can you hear me?
Yes.
You're now the session organizer, so I hand over to you to judge if I can ask one final question.
Well, if it's going to Gunnar, yes, because he will have to leave. If it's going to somebody else, I would guess we may have time to do that in the second break, after the break in the second part of the session.
It was to Gunnar, so I'll ask.
Okay, go ahead.
It's a quick one, so anyway, so I was just curious, relating to the presentation by Professor Garg and Sarita. In terms of the coal phase-out, there was a comment from the Indian perspective that phasing out or phasing down coal will require some financing coming in to the coal sector to liquidate, to basically write off coal assets, which is, of course, a very important policy implication of a coal phase-out. And I wondered if you, who have also looked a lot at the coal phase-out in Germany, if you have a reflection on how this would work in Germany, if you basically have a German perspective on this.
Yeah, there's a concrete answer. So we had a Coal Phase-Out Act that was passed in 2019, actually before the strengthening of the targets. And there was really a big commission that spelled that out. And the bottom line is that there's like a broad societal buy-in, and at the same time there has like a big bailout, and it has a few billions of euros of like really direct compensation for the companies, and several tens of billions for the regions to kind of foster their structural change. So it comes at a significant price, and it's relatively weak. And there's a bit of a discussion that, like, instead of compensating the companies, you could just have increased the carbon price, and then it would have happened by itself. In fact, they are overcompensated. But the bigger question is like getting the buy-in from the affected regions. And Germany is very concentrated in the west and in the east. Like I think it's not lost money. It's a kind of investment that would have made sense anyway. But that's of course something that you need to be able to afford.
Is that follow-up?
Can I just say one thing to that? I'm sorry. We actually quantified that, and it's in a paper in another session, so I can link it. Where we and it's about for Germany. It's about $34 per ton of avoided CO2 emissions. But for there are like 13 countries that have done it with coal phase-out plans, and it ranges from like $5 per ton of CO2 to like $40 per ton of CO2. Yeah. So if you just raise your carbon price, you would have done the same thing.
Thanks. At this point, I think we'll close for the first part, and then I would like to thank all the speakers so far, and we can then reconvene at 11. Thanks. So welcome to part 2 of our session on national decarbonization pathways. The first presenter is Haywan McJohn, and he'll present his perspective on the US. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matthias. Can we get the screen? Oh, we're going to do something on the screen. Yeah, that's the one. Yeah. Oh, we don't need to do anything on the screen. I'm Haywan McJohn, and I'm with the GCAM team. And this is the group effort of myself and many others. We have a paper coming up on the same subject of modeling US long-term strategies this Friday. So stay tuned for that one, and this is kind of a preview for it. Let's see, so before I actually go into the contents of it, I want to say what the purpose is. As modelers, and many of us are modelers, many of us are model data users, we do a lot of research. We have done a lot of research. What does it mean to get to 2 degrees? What does it mean to get to 1.5 degrees? Net zero kind of emerged as this theme, a target for nations to get to so we can stabilize the climate. So this is going from research to a certain policy agenda. And the process that I want to describe today is actually going the other way, is that once the policy agenda is set up to go to net zero, what do you do? How can modelers come back and support how to get to net zero? And that has to be done in a national scale, or sometimes at a city scale, sometimes at a state scale. It's not done. There is no global policy dictator that comes in. We're all going to go to net zero in 2050 and make that happen. Each sovereign nations would make their own decision and support that to make a policy target. And our job as modelers, what I see is that supporting that process, make sure the targets are science-based, and then the pathways to get there is, at very highly ambitious, but certain level of feasibility is ensured. So that's what I'm going to describe. But I'm actually going to rewind 5.5 years. This is the first US mid-century strategy for deep decarbonization we released. I only put this up to emphasize just one thing on the screen, is this particular date. It was scheduled to release, and it did release on a very unfortunate date, in a very unfortunate time. And this whole research basically didn't see the light of day, but it actually serves as a precursor to what I'm going to present today. So that 2016 mid-century strategy, what we had is summarized in this figure. We were going from where the emissions would have been without mitigation, going all the way to 80% reduction. Mind you, 80% reduction in 2016, that was incredibly ambitious. But you fast forward 5 years, so much has changed. Technologies has changed, markets have changed, people's perception of climate change has changed. So much has changed in that both modeling and policies enforce each other to set up this science-based targets of getting to net zero. And as soon as some events happened that wanted to push forward for net zero policy, we were asked to re-equip our model, the 80% reduction model, to do net zero analysis. And all of the summary is actually included in here. Rest of it, I'm going to describe a little bit more in detail what's underneath it. But basically to summarize, we have certain level of emissions, and if we do nothing else, land will degrade, but the naturally GHG reduction would happen under current policy just because solar's cheaper, electric cars coming in and whatnot. And then the first part of the strategy is transforming the energy sector. And for that, we're going to increase efficiency in transport, buildings, and industry. We will also decarbonize the supply side on the electricity using fossil fuels with CCS and renewables and nuclear and whatnot. And finally, we put that together using those low carbon fuels to substitute the fuel inside transport and buildings and industry as we discussed. And that could be decarbonized electricity, but also hydrogen or low carbon fuels such as biofuels. That's not going to be enough. Getting to net zero requires integrated strategy to add up everything. And I think that's much of the value added that we provide is, does it actually add up to net zero? You can have ambitious electrification, ambitious renewable policy. You're still not going to get to net zero unless you squeeze out every emission that you can. And specifically, we do focus on the GHG emissions from methane, N2O, and F gases, and if we squeeze out as much as we can. Still not enough, because we're targeting net zero. I'm going to emphasize a little more in a few slides, is that net zero, the negative part is just as important as the positive part. So how do we create the negative part? And it's similar to Gunnar's presentation, except our scale is much bigger because we have a bigger country and bigger land. You can remove CO2 in many different ways. Highly uncertain, that's why the bar is fuzzy. Highly uncertain how much we can remove using the land sink. And then anything still remaining, the recalcitrant emissions in international air travel and high temperature application industry and whatnot, we will remove it through technological innovations that spans from direct air capture, among other technologies. And once you add them all up, we have finally gotten to net zero. And this type of a robust scientific backing for a policy, I want to emphasize is the importance of this type of research. Not going to spend too much time on GCAM, Global Change Analysis Model. Many of you know, and several times it was shown in the session, in the forum. 32 energy and economy regions, one of them is US, and 300 odd land regions, 200 water basins. We track economy, energy, land, water, climate. We run to 2100 and 5-year time steps. We track 16 different greenhouse gas species. We couple it with climate model, simple and complex. It's a community open source model. Anyone can download it. You do need a big computer to run it, but it's open source in there. and it's developed primarily with US Department of Energy. So the first one, like I said about the negative part, what we learn compared to 80% and going to net zero is in net zero, the negative is so much more important. Not so much more important. Negative is just as important as the positive part because net zero by definition, you need to offset exact amount of positive emissions with negative emissions. US luckily is endowed with a pretty large land sink, so we don't need a lot of extra lift from other technologies such as direct air capture or bio-CCS, but those things come into play depending on how energy demand, energy efficiency policies don't pan out as successfully as expected. We can still go there and offset that emissions using the negative emission technologies. Electricity generation, this one is well studied across the field, and our job is mostly to synthesize what we have found. And we developed two scenarios, standard and advanced. Advanced scenario reflects the current administration priorities of getting 100% clean electricity by 2035. Standard is reflecting more of the GCAM standard assumption where getting to 100% clean in 2035 is pretty hard and leaves a lot of stranded assets there. Our standard assumption is more slowly live out their lifetime and then they retire as they age. So that power sector transition requires lots of investment and capacity additions. Historically, we actually had a really high capacity addition in that 1 year. I think that was 2002. We put in a lot of gas capacity. But that was just that 1 year. And then imagine the challenge that we're facing in 2020s, 2030s, and 2040s of adding that much capacity or more than that much capacity, but you're putting that every year. So you can see how much challenge and that entails. On buildings, not much specific new findings to add, but electrification of all the end uses that includes heating, cooling is already electric, water heating and cooking, all of those being electrified, and it's just a matter of speed at which you can electrify, so we have advanced and standard scenarios. Industry, also electrification is a dominant strategy, but if electrification is not fast enough and it doesn't get delivered, we have some of biofuels and some of hydrogen coming in to fill that gap. Transport is hard. Transport was considered really hard just 5 years ago, but technological innovation happens so quickly, we think there's a lot of more potential to reduce emissions in that space. We developed standard and advanced transport, and you see the competition between hydrogen, electricity, and biofuels, and any remaining oil-based products in there. Let's see, that's going to show up in the next few slides. On the passenger side, I think we're pretty confident that we know, based on literature, that where we're headed when we're going to net zero. And specifically on when you look at the advanced transport, we're looking at practically 90x% by 2035 and by 100% by 2040. Battery electric vehicles and fuel cell vehicles dominating the market. On the standard size, we have more heterogeneity in terms of consumers' choices for electric vehicles versus liquid fuel vehicles, but a lot of that liquid fuel vehicles actually satisfied by biofuels because we can't afford to emit too much. But that's just the new sales, right? And then the modeling studies over and over shows that the stock turnover is a pretty big deal. So even if you go 100% clean in certain year, it's going to take a while for your stock to turn over. So even in the advanced case, going to 90x% by 2035 electric, even by 2050, we're not 100% electrified transport. Of course, on the standard side, it's much slower at 50-50. Freight trucks are harder. American trucks are really big. And those ones, the battery technologies has to evolve a lot more to get it viable to ship around that much cargo. But that said, we developed two scenarios in this case as well. Advanced transport, we assume 100% of trucks electrified or hydrogen by 2045, 2050. On standard, we see more market-based penetration, around 50-50, depending on the short distance, long distance trucks. So again, stock turnover. Trucks tend to turn over a little bit faster because they have a lot of mileage that they put in, but it also depends on the size classes. Advanced transport, you see that, getting to very much squeezing out the diesel-based trucks. And if we modeled it to 2055, it would have gone to zero. Standard transport, a little bit more pessimistic about the prospect. So when we add that all up, we come back to this particular chart I showed earlier. We need to squeeze out emissions in every single sector possible and then offset any of the remaining emissions to get to net zero. But being a good modeler, we can't just develop one scenario. So we're showing 7 scenarios here, but in my server, I have about 200 scenarios that some of them failed to make it to the report. Because we're projecting 2050, we don't want to say that here is a single pathway that is going to succeed and this is the truth. We don't know that, and we want to be frank about it. Like, there's a lot of uncertainty on technology development. We're counting on a lot of advancements in transportation technology and other technology to make this happen, but that's not guaranteed. So we did some sensitivity analysis in terms of what if this heavy-duty vehicle electrification doesn't happen as fast as we wanted? What if the industrial transformation doesn't happen as fast as we wanted? What if the non-CO2 turns out to be much bigger than we expected? Can we still get to net zero? And that's essentially a stress testing of the system. And at least the scenarios that we have tested, there was all viable pathway towards net zero. Last slide, the lessons learned from doing a US long-term strategy. Net zero emission modeling is really hard. It's really hard to do. But net zero GHG modeling, it turns out it's really, really hard. The extra GHG that you need to offset with negative emissions makes the problem so much harder. That's what I just said. Negative part is just as important as the remaining positive part. We can no longer wave a magic wand that we used to do and carbon tax and call it done. Hey, here's this much carbon tax and we'll get rid of all the emissions. We need to listen to the detailed sector models and experts and understand how this sector can transform at the fastest but feasible pace. And lastly, getting to net zero emissions, not just modeling it, but actually getting to net zero emission is a really hard challenge that we're facing. Thank you.
Thanks, Haiwan. Any questions for Haiwan? Good, a lot. I'll start here in the front and then we move around.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. And so I see you have actually more than 2 scenarios, but I think most of them are, correct me if I'm wrong, they're focused on technology change. But like we also had a nice lifestyle session yesterday, so I wonder if you consider lifestyle change also, and maybe that can already in the literature which see can contribute a lot in mitigation. And if you don't, then why? Is there a reason? Yes, thanks.
Yeah, so our study and the sensitivity that we have tested focus mostly on the technological feasibility side. Like I said, among the 200 odd scenarios that we have in the server, yes, we did test several different behavioral change scenarios. Didn't make it into the final report for other reasons. Yeah, in terms of our own research, when we do, as opposed to the policy support, when we do our own research that presumably has a feedback cycle with policy, we do a lot of behavioral change modeling as well.
Hi, Adam Suski, Technical University of Denmark and the World Bank. I have 2 quick questions. The first one is, can you reflect a little bit on the alignment with the program with the blueprint that you published in 2016, how you align with that, with your assumptions. The second one is that in your presentation you focus a lot on the transport decarbonization, and I'm wondering, I saw some studies that indicate that there will have to be a significant amount of grid reinforcements in distribution transmission system, and whether in your advanced scenario, actually this reinforcement can keep up with the electrification that you presented. Thank you.
Yeah, great questions, and thanks for remembering the blueprint. For those of you who haven't seen, the blueprint is, or more broadly, America's Pledge, America's All-In project is that during the absence of federal climate policies, and there were that period, those of you remember, the cities, states, and businesses came together, and it's actually on another room currently talking about that now. Cities, states, and business came together to map out feasible pathways without federal centrally driven climate policies. How far can cities, states, and businesses can push forward in terms of climate actions to reduce emissions? There's a little bit of separation, who does what, but we broadly share the GCAM team umbrella, so we learned from each other a lot. And the blueprint was more of a near term, how can we get there by 2030, how much transformation can we have? And this one's looking at 2050, and we try to align them as best as we can because, it's a pathway. It's not just a destination on an Excel sheet, but you actually have to map out the stock turnover and the pathway. So we try to make that as closely aligned as possible. The second part on the distribution and transmission. I think in this case for me, it's both electricity and hydrogen as well. And it's a challenge. It's a challenge, and this is the part where we had a series of these roundtables talking to the sector experts and including the transport. And this is the area I do think there's going to be, we need a lot more than roundtables, but we need like a lot of these. The top-down global modelers or national modelers talking to a specific transportation sector experts on just the pace of transformation that can happen. I think having more of that conversation is going to be needed as we develop more and more infrastructure for electrification, as well as what worries me more is the hydrogen side of things, but they're both like incredible challenge. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the presentation. One question. You said that being net zero is really hard, but your analysis stopped in 2050, and being net zero means being net zero forever. And in your presentation, you show a lot of high share of biofuels in the transportation sector, and you did not mention much bio-CCS. My question is, what are your assumptions about the land sink? Because land is not a sink forever. So if you can get net zero by 2050, but to be net zero, you have to have a land sink forever. But land is not going to be a land sink forever. So what are the assumptions behind that? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that question. That is a hard challenge. Just first one is clarification. That when you see biofuels in there, 90% of that, actually not 90%. I'm going to say 70% of that biofuel is biofuel with CCS, and then it's used in aviation, it's used in trucks, it's used in shipping and whatnot. So we do have quite a bit of bio-CCS going in there. But like you said, we stopped the analysis at 2050, but there's life after that. And the land side does get harder and harder because you get the easiest land to afforest and and make it into a biomass land. You use the easiest land first, but then it gets increasingly harder because now you're competing with food and other ecosystem services and whatnot. So it does get harder. U.S. Pretty lucky that historically we have been pretty steady in terms of having the land sink, but study after study actually suggests that it's imminent, that it's going to go away unless we do something, put in a lot of effort into it. But contrast that with, so there's a negative side of things, but there's also a positive development is that once you get to net zero, the hardest part of the energy system is mostly over, right? Because it's not a rapidly growing energy system in US, it's pretty steady. So once you shut down coal, shut down gas and shut down oil, after that, maintaining it is not as hard as actively shutting down the existing ones with stranded assets implications and whatnot. So I think those two forces would cancel each other out, hopefully, and then we can maintain, actually not maintain net zero, but we have to go net negative to make up for the historical emissions that's already in the atmosphere. So I think we have to do a lot more research going into how much net zero is a feasible pathway. That's presumably 5 years later what we're going to do. Thank you.
Thanks again, everyone. So the next presenter will be myself. I guess the slides are going to come up soon.
It's a PDF, okay. And then raise my hand, you can start, okay.
Okay, well, you know me already now. I will present a global stocktake study. So we are looking at the combined outcome of all the pledges that were announced at the Glasgow-Copenhagen conference. And this is work, some of the co-authors are here in the room, with colleagues at the JRC in Seville. It was published as the Global Energy and Climate Outlook last year, right after the Copenhagen Climate Conference. So why am I presenting here in the session, which is supposed to be titled, or it has the title, National Pathways, and I'm coming up with a global study looking at global pathways? Well, it's not really just the global pathways, but it's basically an aggregation of a lot of national pathways, because what we do is we look at the targets that have been announced ahead of or during the Glasgow COP, and this means national targets coming up with new targets for 2030, so new NDCs, as well as many net zero targets. So looking at when will particular countries or regions reach net zero emissions. And what we do then is by aggregating those, we are able to say, are these targets on aggregate compatible with the temperature targets mentioned in the Paris Agreement? We do that with an integrated modeling framework. So we have two models involved in the study. One is the poles model, that's an energy-focused model, and we have 66 regions in this model. So you can already see that we can capture some regional detail. That one we use for example, the energy transition, looking at what are the emission consequences. But then we also want to look at some of the socioeconomic consequences, and therefore we couple the poles model with the JRC GEMI 3 model, which is a CGE, an economic model. So that model we can then complement the results with some more socioeconomic indicators. So let's jump right into the main conclusions. So what are the outcomes with and without the pledges? So first, maybe we can look at the global emission trajectories on the current policy, so the policies that are already in place. And this is the purple line at the top, or the pink line at the top, and that would actually bring us on a trajectory which would have increasing emissions over the next couple decades still, and then stabilizing emissions. So in terms of temperature, which are then shown at the right, that would bring us to a bit more over 3 degrees of global warming relative to pre-industrial at the end of the century. So we're not in an SSP 5 world with RCP 8.5, but still it's a considerable warming. Now, what would happen if we deliver on the NDCs? So that's the little dot in there. So that would is our assessment on what these targets would mean for 2030. That would roughly stabilize emissions, maybe slightly decline a bit. But stable emissions at this level still means increasing temperatures. So with that, temperatures would still increase to a bit more than 2.5 degrees by the end of the century. The picture changes a bit more when we put in also the net zero targets, and this is the blackish line. So then you have really a couple of decades with declining emissions. So that would keep temperature actually just below, in the central estimate, below 2 degrees. So the 2 degree mark would be in reach with these trajectories. So how do we get there? There is still a big implementation gap, and what I mean is the difference between the policies or the targets that are announced and the current policy. So basically, additional new policies need to be proposed and implemented to get us to that pathway. And if we deliver on that, then we may get into the realm of 2 degrees of warming. Also, you can see in the stacked colors that most of the remaining emissions in the second half of the century actually comes from non-G20 countries, and this is because most of the G20 countries by now have announced a net zero targets either at 2050 or a bit afterwards. And these countries then that are now shown there, they would be the remaining countries that have not yet announced or come up with a net zero target. Well, while this is getting us to 2 degrees maybe, it is not in line with the 1.5 degree, which is also mentioned in the Paris Agreement. And for that, we would need more emissions reductions both in the short and in the long term. And this is shown in the yellow trajectory, which would then bring us to 1.5 degree. We can call the increase in ambition that would be needed to get us from the announced policies to the 1.5 trajectory, the ambition gap, because that would require new targets that have not been yet put forward. So while this was a look at the global level, we can now zoom in because we have these regional details at the country level. For that, we have plotted the 2019 emissions, normalized those to 1, so that's the dotted line that's going across the screen. So if countries then have in 2030 or 2050 emissions or bars here that are higher than that, that would mean they would increase their emissions relative to 2019 under current policies. Most advanced economies reduce their emissions already under current policies. When we implement the pledges, this would basically remove the part that's the implementation gap, so that would then leave the lower two parts of the bar. And you can see that this implementation gap, again, is quite substantial, especially going to 2050. Of course, that's further away in the future, so policies may not have been in place. But it also reminds us that some countries may have just come up with a pledge without really telling us yet how they would plan to reach this. Also, we can plot here on this figure the ambition gap, and other than in the global scenario, where this just comes from the global trajectories, here it is allocating it to the different countries, so we need to be open on what we assume in terms of equity. So this study was using a differentiated carbon price that was then implemented by having lower carbon prices in countries with lower per capita emissions. High income countries start with higher per capita, higher carbon prices, and they excuse me, carbon prices would converge over time. So this shows that there is also an ambition gap, and especially crucially in some countries in the nearer term, and this of course then is also reflected in the call at the last COP to come up with additional announcements before the next one, which would be this year, and some additional announcements we have already seen, for example, for Australia just recently. Now we can also look, because we're using an energy model, what this means not only in terms of aggregate emissions, but then zooming down or zooming in a bit more into the energy transition. On the figure A, so to your left, you'll see primary energy demand, and you see that a main difference between the current policies and the policy scenario is the growth of energy use overall. So that means quite a bit of energy efficiency comes in. Part of that is coming because there's electrification. So if you're replacing heat or transport energy use by electricity, that by definition basically means you need less primary energy. You also see a change in the composition of the fuel, especially coal is phased out, especially in the 1.5 degrees. And there you can also see that this happens much earlier. So the coal difference you see in 2030, that there is a bigger reduction needed already within this decade. And then you see another difference maybe in the gas, which is then also more reduced in the 1.5 degrees. So this would be additionally abatement that would bring us, or that could close eventually the ambition gap. So if new pledges would come, that would imply even more reductions of the fossil fuel. This is also reflected in the power sector, which is on the left, right? And you can see there that also coal will need to come out of the system earlier. Again, this is a study where we look in detail at the different countries. So we have a short chapter on the G20 countries, looking at describing briefly their situation, and also describing what abatement options would be available in the different countries. And these may be different across the countries because they are quite heterogeneous. But even within countries, you may have differences over time. So you may use different abatement options in 2030 than in 2050. And you may use different abatement options depending on your level of decarbonization. So you may have used different abatement options. I think that was just what Haiwan said. Like, it's hard to get to net zero, but CO2, but then if you go deeper, you need to kind of use the more expensive technologies, so they would come up or come into play when you are moving to more ambitious targets. And this is shown here also on both the global and the regional scale. So you have the world somewhere there in the middle with this big bubble, and it shows you the contribution of the power sector to abatement and the contribution of the AFLU sector. So for the world as a whole, in 2030, about half of the emissions that are reduced relative to current policies would come from changes in the power sector. I think that also goes back to what Gunnar said before the break. In the next decade, that's the easiest way to decarbonize because we already have the technologies in place. And it's important then later on to allow further decarbonization in other sectors. On the global scale, land use related emissions contribute about 15%. So the remaining part, to 100%, that would be then the remainder in all other sectors like our energy sector, non-CO2 emissions, and so on. You also see some illustrative countries here. You see, for example, in the top left, India and China, which have a more coal-based electricity system. So in these countries, the contribution of the sectors of the power sector decarbonization is even more important. On the other hand, you have Latin America or Africa, where emissions from land use may be much more important, especially in the near term. The bubbles that are not filled with colors then represent the situation in 2050. So you see a bit that everything moves left and down. So you kind of a more balanced approach. Well, maybe because you have already harvested the decarbonization from the power sector, but then also basically every sector comes into play. Every abatement option that you have available will need to be taken. So that's why naturally things become less kind of dominated by individual abatement technologies. Finally, I want to have a quick look on the economics. So here we look at the transition of jobs between the sectors. So obviously, when we decarbonize and remove fossil fuels, this is where a drastic, there will be a lot less jobs available compared to the baseline. So this is shown on the horizontal axis. So here we have about 70% less jobs. But, and this is shown on the vertical axis, they contribute a very small share of overall employment. So it's a very concentrated impact to a single sector. You have also another sector that's gaining, and that's the electricity sector, because electricity demand would increase on the global scale. You have also gains in some other sectors like agriculture, for example, for the production of bioenergy, construction sector, because you're there is some need to build the infrastructure, for example, on renewables and grids, even though we're not accounting for everything explicitly in the model. I think that will show how this transition in the energy system also translates into a transition in the power sector. So to conclude and wrap up, current policies would lead us to temperature increases of about 3 degrees, while delivering on the NDCs and net zero pledges would bring at least the 2-degree mark within reach. An ambition gap remains, though, to 1.5 degrees, both in the short and in the long term. And in the report, we show that these ways of getting there are quite heterogeneous across the different countries, or can be quite heterogeneous across the country. For example, you see the contribution of the power sector, but we do see that all countries basically start with decarbonization of the power sector. It's just in some countries, the power sector is already much more decarbonized, so they have to come from other sectors then. And this then also translates to changes in employment. And the whole report is available on our website. There it comes with these country chapters, so I invite you, especially if you're from a country, to look at your section or at that report let us know what you think. It also comes with energy balances, so we publish the data of the energy balances on our website. And maybe just to conclude on relation with the other studies that we had seen here in the session. So why are we thinking that this is still useful? I mean, obviously, national studies using maybe national modeling or even a toolbox of national models, as in Gunnar's presentation, can provide much more detail to looking at the individual countries or regions. However, here what we do is, given that we have a global model, we can also change the boundary conditions for the individual countries. So going with such a more profound global changes will change, for example, energy prices or prices of different technologies. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind also when designing national strategies, that you're not going in isolation, but the boundary conditions may also change. And of course, it has the advantage of aggregating up over countries, so we can then get, for example, these aggregate climate outcomes or emissions or energy consequences. And with that, I would leave it and open up for questions. Dominique, or well, you can go first, and then we'll have Dominique afterwards.
Thank you for the presentation. Thank you. Just one comment. My understanding that you have used POLS to do this analysis, but POLS is an energy-only model. And later in your presentation, you talk about AFOLU and other greenhouse gases. How did you manage to do that using an energy-only model? Thank you.
Thanks, a good question. Although POLS was initially developed as an energy-only model, it does have a soft link to land use, so it's linked to the Globium model. I mean, not coupled, but we do use information from the Globium model in terms of lookup tables, so that can then translate also to changes. We basically get information on changes in the land use, availability of biofuels and so on, and that is then what is kind of reported here as part of the AFOLU sector.
Thanks, Matthias. 3 small questions, I think. So on the other greenhouse gases, were you operating on them as well, the methane and the NOx? It wasn't clear whether there were global policies being implemented or just national, because you talked about convergence. So I didn't quite understand exactly whether there was any cooperation on the convergence or not, or just an assumption. And the third is, are you implementing the net zero targets for all countries or just for some? I mean, I saw China's energy was still increasing, whereas they have a net zero target for 2060. So I don't know whether you had implemented that as well.
Thanks. I'll try to answer all of them, and if I forget something, I'll come back. On the non-CO2, yes, all the Kyoto gases are included in polls, also in GEMI 3, so they're covered. And then the question on the cooperation or what policies are we using, that's a good one, and I rushed a bit over it, so maybe I should have spent a bit more time. So for the scenario where we use only the NDCs and the long-term strategies, there we do model just the national policies. So in some cases we do know what the policies are because they're specified with their specific sectoral targets. So then we try to capture that. For example, if there is a target on building a certain amount of renewables, we try to get those in. If we don't know what the target is and there isn't really also a good information, then, well, it's kind of a more stylized approach, of course, where, for example, a national carbon price is used to kind of get us to that target. In the 1.5 degree scenario, however, that's a different design approach. So there we don't, we basically only use a carbon price that's globally differentiated. So there we don't even have the specific national policies necessarily. So it's just building a 1.5 scenario. Actually, in the report we have another one, so to kind of have a range of kind of one with differentiated carbon prices and one with global carbon prices uniform, to get a range of what that would mean. It would basically mean, in any case, still a quick reduction because it's just hard to get down quick enough and deep enough. And then the final question on which countries do we implement? We implement as many as we can get. So China is implemented, but of course that's a 2060 target. So when we were showing emissions for 2050, yes, there is some remaining emissions in 2050. And we also, I mean, we started initially with putting in the G20 countries because these are covering a big share of emissions, but we did include other NDCs or net zero targets beyond the G20 countries, maybe not as systematic as for the G20 countries where we were in the group kind of allocating the countries to different people, so they were studying them in more detail, and the other one was more kind of an afterthought in putting them in. But we are quite complete. We have above 100 I think 130 or so on that order national targets or national countries targets. So that's even bigger than the number of regions in the model. So we have to do some prior aggregation to get then to aggregate targets.
So for net zero targets, what trajectory of getting there did you assume? Sort of a gradual decline starting from now or 2030 or something else? Because of course total emissions would depend greatly on the actual trajectory.
Good question. So for the countries that have targets in 2030, we would first go to whatever the target they have, and then from there to net zero. And that is actually quite challenging for some countries. So in some countries, I think we had very, well, I mean, it was basically if we want to also reach, say, a 2050 net zero target and the very loose 2030 targets, that's a challenge for the model. So sometimes we over-exceed even the 2030 target just to reach the longer term target by a small amount. And then for the remaining 20 years in between, so I mean, we didn't really specify a pathway, but rather kind of specified, for example, a carbon price that would increase over time. So that would then govern the pathway between those countries. But the main important thing is like, do we start now going down? No, we try to go first to the 2030 midpoint. All right, so I guess we can then move to the next presentation. Which
oh, sorry, we actually had a question from one of our Zoom participants.
Good.
was related more towards the G20 insights that you had. One was from an implementation perspective. You said that there's a lot of heterogeneity. So I wanted your insights when it came to the developing countries, the middle income countries in G20, and also the transition of jobs, because one of the generalized takeaways was not much is seen in the service sector, whereas in India, 55% of the jobs are in service sector. So, and in the formal jobs, and almost, I think 60% or more are in the agriculture and allied sectors. So.
Thanks. Yeah, for the individual countries, so actually in the report we do have the figure that I showed for the globe, showing employment transition between sector. We do have them also for the different countries, so we should have something there for India as well. And then I guess the share of the sectors would be quite different. So it could be that, for example, agriculture has a bigger share than what was shown in the slides that I had on, because that was the global average. In terms of transition policies, well, I mean, we took whatever we had in terms of targets available. So for India, for example, we took the targets that were announced during the COP and implemented those. Yeah, thanks. And unless there's any further questions on Zoom, I guess we'll go to the video presentation by Femke.
The main question I want to answer today is how deep decarbonization scenarios change now that solar costs have come down so rapidly and are projected to continue to fall. This work is part of the EAST project, the Economics of Energy Innovation and System Transition, which is funded by BASE, the British Department for Business and Energy. And the work is done in collaboration with UCL, the University of Exeter, where I'm based, and Cambridge Econometrics. The model we use is E3ME. E3ME is an energy environment economy model. The core of the model is the economics part of the model is demand-led and based on econometrics. So it's based heavily on data. It's highly disaggregated. There's 70 regions, and in each of these regions there are 43 economic sectors. The environmental model we have is a climate model of intermediate complexity, and the technology submodels are based on evolutionary economics, which means they can simulate the characteristic S-curve. These three models all feed back on each other. So when the energy prices go up because we stimulate nuclear, for instance, that has an effect on the economy and on energy efficiency. And the same way, if there's a lot of pollution, this has an effect on health. One of these energy submodels is FTT power. The power submodel is based on investor choices, the dynamics. So if investors think that, if a lot of investors think that a certain technology is cheaper than the alternatives, there is a higher percentage of investors that invest in this certain technology. It's based on replicated dynamics, which means that if you have a small market share, you can't immediately grow. The growth rate is proportional to your current market share. And it's has inertia in it. So each of the technologies has a certain lifetime, and because, for instance, the lifetime of a nuclear power plant is quite long, the share of nuclear power will stay constant, relatively constant over time if it doesn't grow. The grid, to make sure that variable renewables don't disrupt the resilience, we use a residual load duration curve, which computes how much dispatchable energy and storage you need to get a stable grid. The core feedback of this model is the deployment lower costs, the deployment cost feedback. So if you deploy more of a technology, you get learning by doing, you lower the cost, and you get more investments in this technology. This is in contrast with quite a few other energy models where you typically have Moore's law, that you have a fixed percentage of learning each year. And that doesn't, and having this explicitly in there enables us to look at policies that stimulate deployment. Because learning is a function of deployment, we can compute who drives, who has driven the cost declines in solar and who is expected to do so in the future. And you see that pre-2015, it was the EU that caused these deployment-led cost declines. Now it's China, and we project that this will stay the same over the next 10 years. If you look at it globally disaggregated, you see that the cheapest source of energy in 2020 for most countries was wind. And towards 2030, this has completely flipped over, where in most countries the cheapest form of energy is solar. And this is mainly due to the difference in the technologies, where solar energy is more modular, so it has a higher learning rate than wind. And this together brings us to the following projection of global shares of energy production in the power sector. By the year 2050, about half of all power production is solar-based. Up to the year 2030, wind and solar both have an astounding growth, but then solar takes over wind because the learning rate in solar is so much higher, has been so much higher over the past 30 years compared to wind. This varies regionally, however. Some countries, such as Russia, have quite poor conditions for solar industry, and there's no solar industry to start with, so that the uptake of solar takes up to 2040 to really start. Other countries, notably India and China, will see a very rapid uptake of solar, partially because of the good conditions in especially India, and partially because of the policies in place in China that have given solar quite a large share of market traction. There are, however, barriers. First of all, finance. In the global south, it's not always easy for companies to attract finance in the renewable sector, because these sectors are quite new, and investor trust in these countries is generally low. And for some countries, this matters a lot. In Africa, it's supposed to drive 8% of GDP by mid-century, so investment needs are quite high from the power sector. The second one is supply chains. Like most industries, as we've seen throughout the corona crisis, the variable renewable industry has a vulnerable supply chain, with some parts, some minerals, only extracted in a small couple of countries. Grid resilience, if you have such a solar-dominated grids, your grid resilience will go down, especially if you don't have the wind to back it up. And the last one is resistance from incumbents. There is risks of additional support for all technologies if job losses are massive, which they are predicted to be in the case this scenario turns out. Overall, of course, renewables cause more jobs to exist, at least in the short term, but those job losses are usually quite concentrated. Given that these are the barriers, our policies need to go beyond carbon taxes, because the major barrier before was the higher cost of variable renewables with respect to fossil incumbents. But now there are different barriers, and our policies need to change to address this. First of all, in finance, the best thing to do, the more efficient thing to do instead of encumbering poorer countries with high taxes is to offer guarantees to lenders to make sure that these very profitable investments can go through. In supply chain, we can think about policies that focus on energy and energy efficiency. The less energy we use, the easier it is to actually get all the materials needed, and minimum recycled content and other circular economy policies. For grid resilience, we should ease the planning regulations towards wind energy, for instance, what the EU is now doing, and incorporate some more expensive renewables in our grid. Don't only rely on wind and solar. Even small fractions of geothermal, wave tidal, and those smaller technologies can ease the pressure on the grid. And the last one, resistant from incumbents, is very important to make sure that there are just transition policies, because there's still a lot of money in those industries. So if you do not counter these very valid arguments of concentrated job losses, you will likely get strong resistance towards this transition. So the decarbonization scenario we designed, the 1.5 scenario, is trying to take these policies into consideration, and we invest quite a lot in wind energy via feed-in tariffs. We, to compensate for other parts of the economy, we invest quite a lot in BECCS and in energy efficiency, and we get a more balanced mix in the energy. But towards 2060, and of course that's very far in the future, so it's a good question to ask whether you can still believe models then. We still see this big chunk of solar dominating the grid. As for my conclusions, I think we can safely say that a tipping point has been reached. Solar costs are super cheap now, and they will only continue to become cheaper if you look at the last 30 years of cost declines. The barriers to clean power and the dominance of variable renewables are not costs anymore. We have finance, we have grid resilience, we have supply chains and incumbent industries that form the last barriers to clean energy, and our policies should reflect that. In addition to, or maybe even instead of a carbon tax, we should deploy storage to make sure that similar learning will take place in that part of the power sector. We should be deploying wind to anticipate that the need for a resilient grid and the fact that solar outcompetes wind in the medium to long term. We need to give guarantees to finance and stimulate investments in the global south so that incumbent industries don't take another shoehold there. And lastly, energy efficiency. We need to subsidize energy efficient schemes. We need to make sure that it's easy for people to invest in it, because a transition with very large growing energy demand, for instance, from the heat and the transport sector, is only going to be more difficult.
Thank you very much. I think we have Femke online at Zoom, so any questions for her? Roberto?
Thank you very much for the presentation. One question I have, let's say, innovation and deployment was presented as almost the single reason or the single reasons for the reduction in solar panel costs. But what about the China effect here? Basically, China has the entire market now. So it may be an industrial strategy to put prices down, to break other companies in other industries, in other countries, and later on, eventually, price can go up again, because it's not that easy to justify the price of solar energy today because of deployment. It has to do much more with an industrial strategy to dominate the market. The same applies to electric vehicles and things like that. So my question, whether or not this is being taken into consideration in our analysis as well. Thank you.
Going to try to talk. I don't know whether my COVID infection allows. There's certainly evidence that China has subdued prices in the past. But the dominance of China in the market has been there for a couple of years now, and the prices have not gone up. So I don't think the current prices over the last 3 years have any evidence of subdued prices to destroy industries in other countries. And there's good reasons to believe that those are coming from deployment. A lot of the price decline is also not in the panel prices, but in the operation and management, which is more of a global signal that this technology is getting really cheap and mature. That can go on.
Thank you. We could hear you fine. I think Jessica has a question.
Yeah, thank you, Femke. Really interesting. Jessica Jewell from Chalmers University. A couple of questions. One is, how do you parameterize the S-curve, and which S-curve do you assume? Because there are different ones, different trajectories you can assume. And then also, what costs do you consider in your model, and do you calculate profitability? Because you mentioned profitability and the high profitability of solar, but do you calculate profitability for investors? Yeah, those are my questions.
That's a lot of questions. I think I'm going to forget some. The S-curve, we take it in capacity space. It's the replicator equations, which means that the diffusion depends on the current share, prices, and the speed by which each technology can replicate. For instance, that's going to be faster for solar panels than for nuclear power stations. The second question, profitability. No, we don't take that into. We have an expected price that investors have, so that there is a wide distribution of prices that they think a technology goes for. And that's how they make decisions. So 10% of investors believe that solar is cheaper than nuclear. They will invest in that. We take into account the CapEx, the OpEx. We have a system storage, so that we assume that the storage market is going to be designed in such a way that variable renewable technologies have to bear the cost of storage. And that's short-term storage and long-term storage. And we have, for current policies, only in the EU and a couple of small places, a carbon price that's taken into account, but just quite moderate compared to the 1.5 scenario.
More questions? Then I may have a small one. So on the figures, you mainly showed shares, and shares of generation technologies, and wind was looking to go down, being replaced by solar from some point onwards. And I wonder whether that is just because we're looking at shares, or whether it's whether basically absolute wind generation would also go down at some point. Once, say, for example, windmills need to be replaced, they get replaced by solar, going like 2050 or so.
Yeah, the model says that onshore is going to increase to about 2040 and then stabilize, maybe decrease, and offshore is continuing to increase. I'm still trying to figure out whether that's true. I think that it is driven mainly by this big difference in learning curves between the two technologies, where solar becomes way cheaper than wind. And I think it's likely governments will introduce policies to stimulate wind to get a more resilient grid.
Thanks. If there are no more specific questions, then I think we can open it up to a more broader debate. I think the way the session was designed, looking at the value of national pathways, more general questions, maybe also individual questions for the different speakers that are still online also, and the role and the value that these scenarios have, or maybe some suggestions on what we can learn in going forward when we do these analysis for individual countries. Any questions, remarks, comments? Also maybe from those still connected on Zoom. Yes? Can we have a microphone? Yes, thank you.
Yes, thanks. Well, really nice session. But because I also modeled NDC in our global model, and it just include different NDCs in different countries, and then model it globally. But I wonder, like, maybe the question to Johannes, but also maybe to other presenters, like, do you see when you model it, and maybe you have like stakeholder meetings, do you see maybe the gap, well, you do see the gap between maybe the NDCs and maybe the more possible pathways, and how do you deal with that? And also, is there any maybe suggestions from your work that how can you, like you mentioned, maybe close the gap, but how I still see it's a bit missing, like how are you going to do that? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Very good question. Like, what do we do with our scenario results? Like, how do we communicate it with stakeholders? I don't know if Raphael would like to come in. I guess Sarita was also speaking about stakeholders or working with stakeholders, so maybe she has some view on that as well.
I could go ahead with the question. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay. So here, what was interesting is because I have been part of global modeling exercises, and one is that national models bring in a lot more granularity. I can at least speak about the models that we use is at a sectoral level. Energy supply level, we bring in a lot more granularity, which helps us answer a lot of questions which stakeholders do have. And also from my end, there's a lot of, so initially when we did the modeling exercise, it was a theoretical exercise, and now we are coming into the implementation stage, that what is feasible, and hence we have the question of feasibility and all kinds of feasibility kind of coming in. What is the technical potential and what is the actual potential, and then what actually happens on ground. So there are 3 different stages, and that is where, like, talking to policy stakeholders, I can from my model say that we think this is not feasible, but looking at international case studies, can we have certain pilot demonstrations happening for certain kind of technologies? And this is very much focused on technology and not the behavioral change aspect, which would be a huge, I think, exercise altogether. So the model exercise, to certain extent, we do capture a little bit of behavioral change, but from a demand side perspective, there's a lot we do not capture. And there are certain questions that the stakeholder asks from the very demand side perspective, which sometimes we are not able to answer through our modeling exercise, and we have to go out of the model and do certain analysis and then answer their questions. So yeah.
Thanks. I don't know whether Johannes also wanted to come in on that one. Otherwise,
yeah, perhaps I can come in very quickly. Just to, I mean, in a way, I think Sarita said it very, very well. But just to reiterate that also what we are seeing in a lot of our work is that it's very important to, one, have a very, co-construct pathways with the stakeholders and policymakers to make sure that already at the construction phase their questions are taken into account and are responded to by the pathways, of course, but and also to make sure that Sarita touched on this as well, that the modeling tools are designed to respond to questions posed by stakeholders, such as as Sarita mentioned, sectoral granularity is one dimension that I think facilitates constructive engagement with stakeholders, at least through our in our experience. But I also see that Hayvon is standing next to the scene. So and I don't know if it's to respond to this question, but I imagine that you could have some really good insights there. So I'll leave it to you.
We need to be persistent. There's right now there's integrated assessment model bashing going on. #SNARIS forum. Please chime in. So we like to bash models. But I actually do, on my other side, firmly believe that persistent scientific communication actually helps formulate a better policy. Just 6 years ago, dominant strategy for U.S. decarbonization was, hey, let's get a lot of shale gas and shut down coal and use shale gas instead, and we're going to solve climate change problem. How fast things change, you know? The series of modeling papers came out, switching from coal to shale gas, it's not going to solve climate change, right? And policymakers resisted, stakeholders resisted. It's like, our great American shale gas is here, why would we give it up? But then we have goal to get to 80% reduction back then. Now we're going to net zero. You can't get there with shale gas, right? So you need to be persistent in communicating. You need to continue to publish those papers. And surprisingly, just limited American experience, but it does feed back into the policymaking. And fast forward 6 years, nobody is talking about let's decarbonize using shale gas anymore, right? And similarly, I think how it's going to go down in terms of net zero is that if you're going to go to net zero, right now there's a lot of resistance in terms of, no, we don't want to do negative emissions. But you can't go to net zero without negative emissions. And we need to be persistent about, you know, it's a simple math, scientific math, that zero means there's negative and then there's a positive. We need to continue communicating that. And I still firmly believe in the power of academic research that would eventually feed into the policy process. So hopefully, I would be proven right 10 years down the road.
Thanks. Also, maybe to complement this, I mean, in the both you and Sarita mentioned and Johannes mentioned sectoral granularity. I think it's also sometimes regional granularity. Sometimes that's not even covered in the model, so it's more like a complement. Like in the study we've seen from Gunnar, we was talking about, coal in Germany, that's located in really like 2 very specific regions. So you don't necessarily need to model those in a national model, but sometimes you need to have the lens of looking at really the regional problems. I guess in the US or India, which are even bigger countries, maybe sometimes national modeling alone cannot tell the entire story. I'm coming mainly doing EU modeling. Of course, there you have all the different interests from member states. So again, you may want to look at closer, like regional granularity as well. More questions or comments to add?
Can I just come in here? Yeah, here I would also, I think, try to give an example from a coal stakeholder engagement. Obviously, there's a lot of model bashing, but in India, we started, obviously, before the COP26, we started actually addressing the issue and making stakeholders aware. So at a national level, everyone's aware, but the implementation actions will be occurring at a subnational, state, local level, where there are certain regions whose revenue is completely dependent on coal, and they are not aware of this international discussions that are happening. Maybe the leaders could be aware, but people in the coal sector are not aware. So what we did consciously is engaging with them through presenting our data. I mean, they can always say this is not possible, but at least starting that conversation, because that is the first thing we need to know. I mean, what I've realized is, as a country in the coal sector, we are not as aware as many of the stakeholders I've observed in South Africa are aware about the coal phase down. If you go to the union leaders in the coal sector, the main issue short term is coal fires. They're not even thinking about coal phase out. So those are certain things when we are talking with stakeholders at every level, the starting point could be the model results, and then depending on how things go on. So at least that is one way of also saying that we can start using the model results to show the trend. But at the same time, then when we are talking about the feasibility and the implementation, we have to engage with them and actually show this is what has been going on and how it can impact, and then try to see what their reactions are and see if we can move towards those transitions. So.
I also have a question, Matthias. I don't know if there's a question to Sarita's comment from the room. If there is,
there's nobody raising the hand, so go ahead, Johannes.
Okay, perfect. No, then I just have a comment that I see sort of emerging a bit from multiple presentations. Heywan, you mentioned it. Femke, I think you also touched upon it. That and I myself said it, that a carbon tax is not sufficient. I mean, that's and we're not alone. We're not alone in drawing this conclusion, but it's also not. I mean, we're not, let's say, without opponents in this debate. There are people, arguing that the carbon tax will do the majority of the job. So it's an important question to dwell a bit upon. And I would like to ask, I respect that this is not an easy question, but I would like to ask you, Heywan, if you have, in the American case, if you have some, even if it's only emerging ideas around other sort of at a national scale. Of course, it's important to dive into the sectoral scale after, but some ideas around alternative policies, and also and a separate question to, or a related question to Femke, where you mentioned that guarantees to financiers of solar is an important tool, sort of beyond a carbon tax to drive through solar. And I wonder if you have what's the reason that this comes out as the option that you sort of seem to recommend? As a curiosity, not because I have a different opinion. But perhaps starting with Heywan and then going to Femke.
Yeah, thanks. So just to clarify a little bit, when I said carbon tax is not enough, carbon tax alone is not enough. I think that's more accurate. We mentioned the blueprint earlier and America's all-in effort. So basically, the global IAMs had its a phase where we did almost exclusively carbon prices, and that's when we discovered, hey, BECS is actually a really good way to mitigate emissions. Sorry, not good, really efficient way to mitigate emissions if you just have carbon price. But there is no carbon price, there's no global carbon price, and there's no national carbon price that covers all sectors, which is behind all the theory. And just waiting for this elusive carbon price, meanwhile, there's a lot of other policies that can accomplish a similar effect that includes, renewable policy standards, fuel economy standards for transportation, building retrofit standards. There's a lot of policies that can happen while we're waiting for this perfect carbon price. At the end of the day, I don't think, also the flip side is I don't think we can get to net zero without carbon price. So we need both of them. But then it's not one or the other. I think they need to play in together. So carbon price sets up the overall scale, but filling in that gap of taking the low-hanging fruits, I think those needs to happen in the sector by sector. And talking to the sector experts who can comment on, this is so obvious, it needs to happen immediately. Plugging the leak on natural gas pipelines, it should just happen. We can sell those things to geopolitical issues aside. We can sell those things to places that really needs those gas. So those things that just needs to happen, I think before carbon price comes in, it can happen and fill in the gap of the carbon tax would come in and fill in the gap of remaining emission reduction that needs to happen.
Femke, did you also want to respond to the question?
Very well said. One of the things for the carbon tax you should also take into account is how strongly sectors, in the power sector, we know that there's quite a strong response to taxes. So it's a natural instrument there. In other sectors, we don't see such a strong effect of taxes on road. There is already a lot of tax, and it's not influencing kilometers driven much. So in those sectors, you should look at other policies. Why the finance policy? So this is a policy specific for countries with an underdevelopment financial market, such as in Africa, where we see that some countries, for instance, China and other countries, have built up quite a good infrastructure to get finance for fossil fuel infrastructure, but not for renewables infrastructure. So in those countries, if you really want to speed up the transition, you need to make sure that investors don't feel they have such a big risk. So one of the things they might fear is that they don't have a grid connection, that this kind of will not allow them to build out. And this risk is stronger for solar because you have this distributed net. Yeah.
Many thanks. Any final words from someone or any other remarks, comments? If not, then I guess we can close the session, go to lunch, and come back to the plenary, which I remind you is at 2 o'clock, so not as in the initial plan program at 2:30, but already at 2 sharp. Thank you.
Happiness.